This story is titled, My Parents Ignored My Elder Brother's Brutal Bullying for Years. So I finally moved out. 6 years later. They are calling. Hey everyone. We put a lot of time and effort into finding these stories to keep bringing you the best content. If you enjoy what we do, it would mean the world if you hit that subscribe button. Your support really makes all the difference and keeps this journey going strong. Thanks so much for being here with me. Now let's start the video. OP starts by saying, Hey Reddit, I don't really post personal stuff like this often, but lately I've been doing a lot of reflecting on my past. This post is probably going to be long, because there's a lot to unpack. I guess it's kind of therapeutic for me to write it all out. Growing up, my family dynamic was complicated, to put it lightly. I always felt like the invisible kid, like I was just an extra piece in a puzzle that was already complete without me. My older brother, Blake, was the main character in our family, and I was just the side note. Blake has ADHD, and while I understand now that it can make things difficult, it felt like my entire childhood revolved around accommodating him. I don't remember a time when Blake wasn't the center of attention. It's like he had this gravitational pull, and everyone, especially my parents, orbited around him. From the moment I was born, it was clear that Blake didn't want me there. He was 5 years old, and instead of being excited about having a little sibling, he seemed to hate me on sight. Blake's jealousy started early. I was too young to remember the details, but my mom would tell stories about how he'd throw massive tantrums whenever she or my dad gave me any attention. As I got older, I started noticing it myself. If I was playing with a toy, Blake would snatch it out of my hands, even if he didn't actually want it. It was like the simple fact that I was enjoying something made him furious. Birthdays were the worst. You know how birthdays are supposed to be a big deal when you're a kid? A day where you get to feel special? Not for me. Blake made sure of that. Every single year, he'd throw some kind of fit. He'd cry, scream, knock over the cake, or just make a scene in front of everyone. My parents' reaction? Blake doesn't mean it. He's just overwhelmed. Or, you know how Blake gets. I didn't even care about the presents after a while. I just wanted one day where I wasn't overshadowed by Blake's drama. But it never happened. Even when I was older and tried to advocate for myself, it was like my parents didn't hear me. Blake always came first. When I was little, I tried to brush off Blake's behavior because, well, I didn't know any better. But as I grew older, it became clear that he wasn't just difficult, he was a bully. He'd push me, shove me, or knock things out of my hands for no reason other than to assert his dominance. He bit me a few times too. And while I know that sounds ridiculous now, it was genuinely terrifying as a kid. My parents would say, "Oh, he's just being a big brother." Or, "You'll understand when you're older." Spoiler alert, I don't understand. And I never will. The worst part wasn't even Blake's bullying. It was the fact that my parents let him get away with it. Every time I told them how much it hurt, they'd just shrug it off. Blake's special. You need to be patient with him. Patience. That word makes my skin crawl now, because it was always directed at me, not at him. Why wasn't he the one who needed to learn patience? Why wasn't he taught to control himself? I think what hurt the most was that they made me feel like my feelings didn't matter. If I cried after Blake hit me or screamed at me, they'd comfort him, not me. He didn't mean it, they'd say, over and over. It's like they thought I was the problem for not being more understanding. I remember sitting in my room sometimes, crying and wondering if I was being dramatic. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I was the one in the wrong. But deep down, I knew it wasn't fair. Blake's behavior wasn't just limited to me, though. He struggled socially, too. He never had many friends, and my parents would try to set up playdates for him. Those were disasters. He'd act out, make the other kids uncomfortable, and then they wouldn't want to come back. My parents always seemed more embarrassed for him than concerned about how his actions affected others. Meanwhile, I learned early on to keep my head down and avoid rocking the boat. I became the good kid because I didn't want to add to their stress. But being the good kid didn't mean I got rewarded. It just meant I was ignored. I longed for a normal sibling relationship. The kind you see in movies where brothers or sisters look out for each other. I wanted a protector, not a tormentor. Instead, I got Blake, who seemed to delight in making my life miserable. One of the most vivid memories I have is from when I was about 13. I begged my parents to take me on a trip to Disneyland. Just the three of us. For once, I wanted something special that didn't involve Blake. After days of pleading, they finally agreed. The plan was to leave Blake with our grandparents for 3 days and have some one-on-one time with me. I was so excited, I couldn't sleep the night before. But when Blake found out about the trip, he lost it. He screamed, cried, and even threw things around the house. He got in my face, yelling that he'd kill me if I tried to steal our parents from him. I'll admit, I was scared. I didn't know what he was capable of. My parents, instead of standing up for me, begged me to let him come along. It's the only way to calm him down, they said. I caved. I didn't want to, but the guilt tripping worked. And just like I feared, the trip was a disaster. Blake refused to ride any of the rides and spent the entire time clinging to my mom. He complained about the crowds, cried about the noise, and ruined what should have been a magical experience for me. I'll never forget how crushed I felt that day. It was supposed to be my moment, and instead, it became another chapter in The Blake Show. By the time I was a teenager, I started realizing just how much my family dynamic had shaped who I was, and not in a good way. It's like every year that passed, I could feel the resentment building. Blake was Blake, and nothing was ever going to change that. But my parents? They were the ones who had the power to make things better, to set boundaries, to protect me. Instead, they just let everything slide. I started to think about what life might look like if I could just get away. It wasn't a sudden realization, but more of a slow burn. Little moments kept adding up. Like the time Blake smashed one of my school projects because I was getting too much praise for it, and my mom didn't even bother to reprimand him. Or when my dad lectured me about being more understanding after Blake shoved me into a wall because I wouldn't give him the TV remote. I spent a lot of time in my room, thinking about how unfair it all felt. My parents weren't bad people. They were just completely blind to what they were doing. They thought they were helping Blake by letting him act however he wanted, but all they were doing was enabling him. And while they were so focused on him, I was falling through the cracks. I knew I had to leave eventually. It wasn't even a choice anymore. It was a necessity. I started thinking about college as my way out. Not just any college, though. I wasn't going to stick around in our small town, where my parents could guilt trip me into coming back home every weekend. I needed to get far away, where I could finally start living for myself. I didn't want to be the person who spent their whole life cleaning up after someone else's messes. When I was 17, I started applying to schools, focusing on ones that were as far away as possible. I'd stay up late researching campuses, trying to imagine what it would feel like to have my own space, my own life. It was like planning an escape route, and I put everything I had into it. Of course, my parents weren't happy when they found out. I still remember the night I told them. We were sitting at the dinner table, and I casually mentioned that I had applied to a university on the other side of the country. My mom froze mid-bite, and my dad put down his fork like I'd just told them I was moving to Mars. "Why would you want to go so far away?" my mom asked, her voice already starting to rise. "You have great schools right here. What's wrong with staying close to home?" I tried to keep my cool. "I just want to experience something different. I think it would be good for me." That's when my dad jumped in. "Blake needs you here. You know how hard things are for him. You can't just leave him like that." That comment hit me like a punch to the gut. Blake needs me? What about what I needed? I looked at them both, trying to find the right words to explain how much I was suffocating in that house. But I knew they wouldn't understand. They never did. "I'm not responsible for Blake," I said, as calmly as I could. "I need to live my own life." That's when the conversation took a turn I'll never forget. My dad, clearly frustrated, blurted out something I don't think he even meant to say. "We had you so that Blake would always have someone to take care of him." I stared at him, my stomach dropping like a rock. My mom immediately jumped in, trying to backtrack. "He doesn't mean it like that," she said, her voice shaking. "Of course we love you. You're just part of the family plan." Part of the family plan? I don't know if they realized how much damage those words did, but in that moment, everything clicked for me. My whole life, I'd felt like I was second place to Blake. Now I knew why. I wasn't just second place. I was a backup plan. I didn't say much after that. What could I say? The idea that my parents didn't see me as my own person, but as an extension of Blake's care, was too much to process. I excused myself from the table and went upstairs, closing the door behind me. That night, I made a promise to myself. No matter what it took, I was going to leave. I wasn't going to let my parents' expectations trap me in a life I didn't want. I didn't care if they called me selfish or ungrateful or whatever else they wanted to throw at me. For once, I was going to put myself first. The next few months were a whirlwind. I threw myself into my schoolwork, determined to get the grades I needed for a scholarship. I started saving every penny I could from my part-time job, even though it wasn't much. And when acceptance letters started coming in, I didn't tell my parents right away. I wanted to have a plan in place before I broke the news. When I finally told them that I'd been accepted to a university across the country, they didn't take it well. My mom cried. My dad tried to guilt trip me, saying I was abandoning the family. They even threatened to cut me off financially, which was laughable considering they hadn't saved much for my college fund to begin with. But I didn't care. I had already talked to my grandparents, who were the only ones who truly supported me. They offered to let me stay with them until I was ready to leave for school, and even said they'd help me with some of the costs. It wasn't ideal, but it was enough. The day I packed my bags and left for my grandparents' house was the first time I felt like I could breathe. My parents tried one last time to convince me to stay, but I didn't look back. I knew I was doing the right thing. That summer, I worked harder than I ever had before, saving up as much money as I could and preparing for the next chapter of my life. I was scared, sure, but I was also excited. For the first time, I felt like I had a future that was truly mine. Looking back now, I realized that leaving wasn't just about escaping Blake or my parents' expectations. It was about finding myself, about proving to myself that I was more than just an afterthought in someone else's story. And even though the road ahead was going to be tough, I knew I was ready for it. When I finally left for college, it felt like stepping into another world. For the first time, I could breathe without constantly looking over my shoulder for Blake or worrying about what my parents wanted. I won't lie and say it was easy. Those first few months were tough, but it was the freedom I had been craving my entire life. The hardest part was figuring out how to make ends meet. My parents followed through on their threat to cut me off financially. Not that they had much to offer anyway, but it still stung knowing they were serious about it. It wasn't just about the money, it was about how little they valued me as a person. I didn't hear from them after I left, not even a single call or text to see if I was okay. They made it clear that if I wasn't willing to play the role they had planned for me, I wasn't worth their time. Thankfully, my grandparents had my back. They let me stay with them for the summer before I left for school, and even helped cover some of the costs to get me started. My grandpa gave me this long speech about how I should never feel guilty for leaving, and how proud he was of me for wanting to chase my dreams. It was the kind of support I'd never gotten from my parents, and I think it's the only reason I didn't completely fall apart. When I got to campus, I realized just how unprepared I was for the real world. Most of the kids around me seemed to have it all figured out. They had supportive families, money to spend, and no clue what it was like to go it alone. Meanwhile, I was juggling part-time jobs, student loans, and the overwhelming feeling that I didn't belong. I worked as a server at a diner near campus, pulling late shifts to make rent and afford textbooks. There were nights I'd come home so tired I could barely stand, but I knew I didn't have a choice. I had to make it work because there was no safety net waiting for me if I failed. Despite all the stress, I loved being on my own. No one was breathing down my neck, telling me to be patient with Blake, or guilting me into doing something I didn't want to do. For the first time in my life, I was in control. It wasn't just about financial independence, though. Emotionally, I was finally starting to unpack everything I'd been through growing up. I didn't realize how much damage my family dynamic had done until I was away from it. In high school, I was always so focused on surviving day-to-day life that I never had the time to process how I really felt. But in college, there were nights I'd lie awake in my tiny dorm room, replaying memories in my head and trying to make sense of it all. One thing that stuck with me was how little my parents had tried to support me once I left. I wasn't expecting them to beg me to come back or anything, but the complete silence was deafening. I used to think that deep down, they cared about me in their own way. But after months of not hearing a word from them, I started to question if that was true. Did they ever care about me? Or was I really just an accessory to Blake's life, like my dad had said? Meanwhile, I started to hear bits and pieces about what was going on back home from my grandparents. Blake wasn't handling my absence well. Without me there to absorb his anger, he started acting out in new ways. My grandparents told me he had started bullying neighborhood kids, throwing tantrums over the smallest things, and generally making life miserable for everyone around him. Part of me felt guilty, like maybe I'd made things worse by leaving, but another part of me felt relieved. For once, it wasn't my problem to deal with. Despite everything, I started to thrive in my new environment. I made a few close friends, people who didn't know about my past, and just liked me for who I was. It was refreshing to be around people who didn't treat me like I was invisible, or expect me to constantly put someone else's needs ahead of my own. Slowly but surely, I started to feel like I was becoming my own person. Academically, I worked my ass off. I wasn't the smartest person in the room, but I was determined to prove to myself that I could succeed on my own terms. Every A I earned felt like a middle finger to my parents, like I was showing them I didn't need their approval or support to make something of myself. I didn't just want to survive, I wanted to thrive. By the time I graduated, I had a degree, a job lined up, and a sense of accomplishment I'd never felt before. My grandparents were there at my graduation, cheering me on from the stands. My parents? Not a word. I didn't expect them to show up, but it still hurt. It was another reminder of how little I meant to them outside of my role in Blake's life. After graduation, I moved to a new city and started my first real job. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well. And for the first time, I didn't have to worry about money every second of the day. I was finally able to start paying off my student loans and, more importantly, begin repaying my grandparents for the financial help they'd given me over the years. They never asked for a dime back, but it mattered to me to show them how much I appreciated everything they'd done. Meanwhile, I kept hearing updates about Blake from my grandparents. His behavior was getting worse, and my parents were struggling to manage him. He had started targeting the neighborhood kids, throwing water on them and yelling at them to stay off his street. Eventually, one of the parents had enough and called the police. Blake was arrested for harassing children, and my parents had to bail him out. Hearing about it didn't surprise me, but it did make me sad. Blake was still the same person he'd always been, and my parents were still enabling him. Through all of this, my parents never reached out to me. Not even once. It's like they had written me off completely. And honestly, I was okay with that. I didn't need them in my life anymore. I had spent so much of my childhood trying to earn their love and approval, and I was done. I was finally living for myself, and it felt amazing. Of course, that silence wouldn't last forever. One day, out of the blue, my phone rang, and I saw my dad's number on the screen. After 6 years of nothing, they were reaching out. I didn't know what to expect, but I had a feeling it wasn't going to be good. At first, I thought it might have been an accidental call, but something in me couldn't let it go. I stared at my phone for a few seconds, debating whether to answer. Against my better judgment, I picked up. Hello? My voice was cautious, almost shaky. Hey, it's Dad. His voice sounded older, more tired. How are you doing? It took me a second to respond. I mean, how do you even answer a question like that from someone who hasn't spoken to you in years? I'm fine, I said, my tone neutral. What's going on? He hesitated. That's when I knew something was up. My dad wasn't the type to beat around the bush unless there was bad news involved. Your mom and we've been talking and we think it's time we put everything behind us. We miss you and we want to make things right. I didn't say anything at first. My brain was working overtime, trying to figure out what angle they were playing. Why now? Why after 6 years of nothing? I wasn't buying the whole "we miss you" act. That's nice, I said, keeping my tone flat. But what do you really want? He sighed, like he was disappointed I didn't fall for his script. Look, we've had a hard time lately. Blake's gotten into some trouble. There it was. I knew it wasn't about missing me or wanting to reconnect. It was about Blake, just like everything else in my life had been. What kind of trouble? I asked, already dreading the answer. He hesitated again before launching into the story. Apparently, Blake's antics had escalated to the point where the neighbors were fed up. He'd been harassing kids in the area, throwing water at them, and yelling at them to stay off the street. Eventually, the parents got involved, and one of them called the police. Blake was arrested, and now he had a court date coming up. Okay, I said slowly. And why are you telling me this? We need your help, he said bluntly. Your mom and I are at our wits' end. We're trying to get Blake into therapy, but we're struggling with the costs. And with this legal case hanging over his head, we're going to need a lawyer. We thought, well, you're doing well now, aren't you? Maybe you could pitch in. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. 6 years of silence, and now they were asking me for money? Not even for themselves, but for Blake, the same person who made my childhood a living hell? Are you serious? I asked, my voice shaking with anger. Come on, he said. You know how hard it's been for us, trying to take care of him. You're his sister. Don't you think it's time to step up and help the family? I snapped. All the anger, all the resentment I'd bottled up for years came flooding out. Help the family? You mean the same family that abandoned me the second I decided to live my own life? The same family that let Blake torment me for years without lifting a finger? Are you actually asking me to help the person who made my life miserable? My dad tried to interrupt, but I wasn't done. You didn't care about me when I needed you. You didn't call me once in 6 years. And now you want me to swoop in and fix everything? Absolutely not. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then my dad said, We're sorry, okay? We know we messed up, but Blake is struggling, and we don't know what to do. Can't you find it in your heart to forgive us and help out? I laughed bitterly. You think this is about forgiveness? You think an apology is enough to erase years of neglect and abuse? You don't get to apologize and expect me to save the day. I'm not Blake's caretaker, and I never will be. That's your job, not mine. I hung up before he could say anything else. My hands were shaking, and I had to sit down to calm myself. I wasn't sure if I was more angry or hurt. They had some nerve, calling me after all these years and acting like I owed them something. Later that night, my mom sent me a long text message. It was full of apologies and promises to do better. She admitted they should have handled things differently when we were kids and that they regretted how they treated me. But she also doubled down on asking for my help, saying that Blake's situation was dire and that they couldn't do it alone. I didn't respond. I didn't know how to. Part of me wanted to tell them to go to hell, but another part of me felt guilty, even though I knew I shouldn't. No matter how much I tried to convince myself that I didn't care about them anymore, a small part of me still did. I spent the next few days trying to sort through my feelings. Was I being too harsh? Should I give them another chance? Or was this just another manipulation tactic to drag me back into the chaos I'd worked so hard to escape? But every time I started to doubt myself, I thought back to the years I spent begging for their support, only to be dismissed. It wasn't just about Blake's bullying. It was the constant message that my feelings didn't matter, that I was secondary in my own family. I wasn't ready to forgive them, not when they only reached out because they needed something. That week, I had a long conversation with my grandparents. They had always been my safe haven, and I needed their perspective. I told them everything, how my parents had called, how they wanted financial help for Blake, and how angry I felt about the whole thing. My grandpa listened quietly, nodding as I vented. When I finally stopped to catch my breath, he said something that stuck with me. "You don't owe them anything," he said firmly. "They made their choices and now they're dealing with the consequences. It's not your job to clean up their mess." Hearing that from him was like a weight lifting off my chest. For years, I had carried this unspoken expectation that I was somehow responsible for my family's happiness. But the truth was, I had done everything I could. I had spent my entire childhood accommodating Blake, sacrificing my own needs to keep the peace. I had given enough. Even so, I couldn't completely ignore what my parents were going through. Over the next few weeks, I kept tabs on the situation through my grandparents. They told me that Blake's court date was coming up and that my parents were scrambling to figure out how to handle it. Apparently, they had met with a lawyer who told them Blake might avoid jail time if he agreed to court-mandated therapy. That sounded like a good thing, but my grandparents were skeptical. They didn't think my parents would follow through with it, especially since they'd resisted getting Blake professional help for years. "Your mom still thinks she can handle him on her own," my grandma said. "She's too proud to admit she's in over her head." Hearing that made me sad, but it also made me angry. My parents had spent years enabling Blake's behavior, refusing to hold him accountable for anything. And now they were dealing with the fallout of their own choices. They were desperate for help, but not because they wanted to make things right with me. They wanted me to step in and fix things for them, just like they had always expected me to do. That realization helped me solidify my boundaries. If my parents truly wanted to repair our relationship, they needed to prove it wasn't just about Blake. They needed to acknowledge the years of neglect and pain they caused me and make an effort to change. I wasn't going to be their backup plan anymore. A few weeks later, my grandparents told me that Blake's court date had come and gone. The judge had ordered him to attend therapy and issued a restraining order that required him to stay away from the neighborhood kids he had been harassing. My grandparents seemed cautiously optimistic, but I wasn't holding my breath. Therapy could help, sure, but only if my parents actually supported the process. Given their track record, I wasn't convinced they'd follow through. Meanwhile, my parents hadn't tried to contact me again, at least not directly. My grandma mentioned that my mom had been venting about me during one of their conversations. According to her, my mom was frustrated that I hadn't responded to her messages and felt like I was punishing them by staying distant. When my grandma told me that, I just shook my head. It wasn't about punishment. It was about protecting myself from more hurt. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. My parents were too stubborn to let things go, especially when it came to Blake. And sure enough, a few days later, I got a message from a number I didn't recognize. It was my dad, using a new phone to reach out. The message was short and to the point. Period. "We're sorry if we upset you. We just want to talk. Please give us a chance." I stared at the message for a long time, debating whether to reply. On one hand, I was curious. Had they really changed? Did they genuinely want to mend things? Or was this just another attempt to rope me back into their drama? On the other hand, I didn't want to open the door for more manipulation. I'd worked so hard to build a life away from their chaos, and I wasn't sure I was ready to risk it. In the end, I decided not to respond. I wasn't ready to face them yet, and I wasn't going to let guilt dictate my choices. If they truly wanted to make amends, they would have to prove it through their actions, not just words. After ignoring my dad's latest attempt to reach out, I finally felt like I was beginning to close a chapter in my life that had been left open for too long. My childhood and teenage years had been defined by my family's dysfunction. But now I was in control. Still, that didn't mean the emotions disappeared overnight. There was a lot I had to process, and the journey to truly moving on was far from easy. A few weeks after my dad's text, I got an update from my grandparents about how things were going back home. Blake had started his court-mandated therapy, but not without resistance. Apparently, he had thrown a massive fit before his first session, yelling that he didn't need help and that everyone else was the problem. My grandparents said my mom had to practically drag him out of the house to get him there. Hearing about that didn't surprise me. It was classic Blake behavior, but it did make me feel a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, I was relieved he was finally being forced to confront his issues. On the other hand, I couldn't help but wonder if therapy would actually help him, or if it was too late for meaningful change. Years of enabling don't just disappear because of a court order. Meanwhile, my parents were still struggling financially. Between Blake's legal fees, the fines they had to pay, and the cost of therapy, they were barely keeping their heads above water. My grandparents mentioned that they'd had to step in a few times to help cover expenses, even though my parents hadn't asked directly. My grandparents didn't seem happy about it, but they said they couldn't stand by and watch my parents sink. I felt bad for my grandparents. They'd already done so much for me, and now they were being dragged into my parents' mess. I told them they didn't have to keep me updated if it was too stressful for them, but they insisted they wanted to. "You deserve to know what's going on," my grandma said, "even if you're not involved." Despite everything, my grandparents were still encouraging me to maintain some kind of distance. They knew how much pain my parents had caused me, and they didn't want me to get sucked back into that dynamic. "They need to learn how to stand on their own," my grandpa said, "and you need to keep living your life." I still heard updates from my grandparents every now and then. They told me that Blake's therapy sessions had been rocky, but that the therapist was optimistic about his progress. My parents, meanwhile, were still trying to repair their reputation in the neighborhood after everything that had happened with Blake and the local kids. It sounded like they had a long road ahead of them, but that was their journey to navigate, not mine. As for me, I started making plans for the future. I'd been saving up for years, and I was finally in a position to travel, something I'd always dreamed of, but never had the chance to do. I booked a trip to Europe, just me in a backpack, and the thought of exploring new places on my own was both exciting and terrifying. Before I left, I made sure to visit my grandparents. I wanted to thank them for everything they'd done for me, for their support, their love, and their unwavering belief in me, even when my parents didn't. We spent the day reminiscing about old times, and my grandpa gave me one of his famous pep talks before I left. "You've been through a lot," he said, "but you've come out stronger because of it. Don't let anyone take that away from you." As I boarded the plane for my trip, I thought about how far I'd come. My parents might never fully understand the pain they caused me, and Blake might never change, but that was okay. I wasn't living for them anymore. I was living for myself, and for the first time in my life, that was enough.